Hello and welcome to this webinar on feedback. In this webinar, we will focus on the power of feedback and how we can use it in the classroom to really help students to feed their learning forward. My name is Michael Chiles and I am a teacher and leader in the Northwest. I've now been teaching for 15 years, and in my time whilst I've been teaching, I've also been writing several books to help teachers with their own practice, of which one of them is the key focus for today's webinar, which is the feedback pendulum. Now, before I start to talk about feedback and the role that it can have in the classroom and how we can use it to support learning, I want to talk about some core principles that I believe are really crucial when we are approaching feedback in relation to both formative and summative assessment. Now, in the classroom, we will be doing some form of formative assessment throughout the lesson as we check for understanding. And in that instance, we might need to give feedback. We'll also be doing feedback through our summative assessments, those less frequent opportunities where we'll capture checking for understanding in a bigger sort of broader concept when we're looking at maybe an end of unit test or a test that contains a broader range of content that was taught over the period of time. And so I talk about this craft of teaching and craft of assessment, and what underpins that is the feedback process. Craft stands for condense, which is about creating those powerful notes that pupils can use to then reflect, and then they can then use those notes to reflect on the knowledge that have been taught. And through that, they can then keep revisiting previously taught concepts and processes within your subject. And then we've got the assessment part, and then through that assessment part, when we're checking for understanding, we've got the feed forward and the target driven improvement. Now, the feed forward and target driven improvement are those crucial parts that we're going to focus on today, but we'll also build in some elements of the reflect and assess and where feedback can be used to really help students to move forward with their learning. Now, there are times where you've probably received feedback that's made you feel really happy, really content, and you've been really pleased by that feedback. It's made you feel good about yourself. And often when we give students feedback, there'll be times when they're really pleased with the feedback we've given them. But equally, there'll be times when they're a bit confused by the feedback, where there's a puzzled look, where actually what you've said or what you've written down isn't quite as clear as what you had anticipated. And so within a school environment, we've got a multitude of feedback processes that are happening throughout the day. And at times that feedback can get overwhelming, where students and teachers themselves are not able to process that feedback and not able to action it. And what we'll look at in this webinar is that action is actually the most important part of giving anyone any feedback. And so I want you to pause the webinar for a minute, have a think about your current areas of strength and maybe areas for development around your use of feedback at the moment. What is it that you do really well? And what is it that you know at this moment in time, as you reflect, you could do better at? And it might be around the type of feedback that you give, which we'll explore further. It might be around the frequency of the feedback you give, or it might be around reducing the workload that's associated with the current feedback you give to pupils. And before we do that, let's have a think about learning. Now, we know that learning is a process that takes place over time from cognitive science research. And therefore, when we're looking at a snapshot of one single lesson, we may not necessarily see or get an idea of what has actually been learned, because it's what we're seeing whenever we assess and check for understanding is often performance. And actually, because learning takes place over time, it's quite messy, that we want to be careful about making the judgments about whether something has definitely been learned, because in one lesson where you teach something, you give a bit of feedback. It might be verbal feedback, or it might be written feedback. Students are able to express the ideas that you wanted them to correctly, but then weeks later they may not. They may not be able to recall that. And that all comes back to this process of learning. Through Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, we know that actually memory will diminish over time if we don't revisit it. It comes back to those principles of craft, that idea of constant reflection to enable and support regular feedback that allows students to feed forward. And so in David Didal's definition of learning, this fits really well. He talked about learning, about the long-term retention of knowledge and the ability to transfer into new contexts. Retention being its durability and the transfer being its flexibility. And therefore we need to be mindful when we give feedback. How is that enabling students to feed forward to have that long-term retention of knowledge and then transfer it into new contexts? We'll look at some examples in this webinar today. And so what is the purpose of feedback? Now, if I reflect on the past and the issues around feedback that still pervade schools up and down the country today, is that idea that the concept of feedback, giving feedback to students or to anyone else in education, has been sort of intertwined and used in relation to the phrase marking. Now, marking is about looking at a piece of work, giving it a mark, and then awarding a grade. Now, in education, we want to do that less frequently. So in our classrooms, as teachers, we want to do that as minimal as possible, because actually, when we do that, it can be a distractor and it can lead to pupils rejecting and not wanting to receive the feedback because, for example, if they've got a target of a 6, let's say it's a year 11 student, and they get a 3, it can really deflate them and really lower their self-esteem, and they feel, I can't do this anymore. And so we want to keep marking to a minimum and make it infrequent. So we might see marking as something that we use when we do an end of year exam or when we do mock exams for year 11, but not something that we do regularly on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. And so when I reflect on the issues as to why marking has got confused with feedback, I think back to some of the experiences I've had and some of the experiences of what I've heard from other teachers up and down the country as I've been supporting them in their development of feedback within the classroom. And some of the issues around it has been egocentric driven marking. That idea that marking is all about giving students lots of praise and telling them how well they've done, but not actually what they need to do next. And praise is important in the classroom, but it's about how we can monitor that praise and ensure that that praise is given in a precise and timely manner that actually supports learning rather than drowning them in praise for the sake of it. And then we've got the deep triple marking. So years ago, there was the process when I first started teaching that you'd mark a work, hand it back, and then you'd mark it again after they'd improved it. And we know that that was dispiriting for teachers. There's too much emphasis on the teacher doing the work and the student not doing or taking ownership of their own learning. And then we've got that idea of actually, the more you marked as a teacher years ago and the more red pen that was in your exercise book as school leaders came around and did book looks, checks, that was actually seen as good practice. If you had lots of marking and red pen in your book, you were giving good feedback. And we know that that's not the case, because we can write as much as we want to write in a student's book, but it doesn't mean that what we intended to write has been received in the right way and also then action. And actually, more often than not, we used to end up, especially me as a teacher during that time, writing the same comment over and over again. And so the quantity became king over quality. And as we said, that mark and grade focus takes away from actually what do we want students to do to feed forward in those next steps to improve that long-term retention of knowledge and transferability into new contexts. And so all of those experiences that I had, many teachers during that time, and even teachers today that are still having to do these elements when giving feedback, they were reflected in the Independent Workload Review 2016 that talked about the excessive reliance on labour-intensive written comments using different coloured pens, often disjointed from the learning process, failing to help pupils improve their understanding. Process can be dispiriting for teacher and pupil, reducing motivation and resilience, and it can be unmanageable for teachers with unrealistic deadlines. And so when I talk about feedback and when I wrote about it, whenever I give any training and support to schools and teachers, I always talk about feedback as being an opportunity to focus on pupils' current performance, where they're at the minute, and then combine that with feed forward strategies, whether that is comments, next steps, activities that we want them to do in order to look ahead on advice on how to do better based on what it was that we wanted them to do in the first place. And by combining these two factors, feedback and feed forward strategies, that can be really powerful to help support people's learning. And so the art of feedback comes under 3 key strands. Giving feedback is really, really easy. We can give feedback on a regular basis to our students, no matter what we do every day, whether it be for answering a question, whether it be through circulating the room and checking and redirecting them if they're unsure about something, or if we feel that they're not quite doing what we want them to do, through that verbal feedback, whether it be through writing something down. We can give feedback really, really easily, but how it's received is not always focused on. And we can't be certain all the time that it's received as we expected it to be received. And if that's the case, and if we can't be certain all the time of what's been received, then the action part becomes almost blurred. And actually the action part is the most important aspect of any feedback, because all the research suggests, and in particular some of the research that John Hattie did, that students need to do something with that feedback in order for it to have an impact. Otherwise, it becomes just lip service. It becomes a tick box exercise where we give feedback, pupils and students receive it, and then nothing else happens afterwards. So later on down the line, when we're teaching another aspect of the curriculum, we've got some common threads of what we wanted them to do. They may repeat the same mistake because they received beforehand wasn't understood. And so as teachers, we shouldn't assume that what we intend to give in terms of feedback, even if we understand it, we shouldn't assume that what is received is the same as what's being given. And in the classroom, we can always mitigate against that by checking for understanding, checking that students actually know what is expected of them in terms of the feedback you've given them, and also getting them to repeat back to you what the next steps are in terms of improving them as a learner. And so when John Hattie wrote the afterward for the feedback pendulum, one of his statements really stuck out for me. It struck a chord about feedback that we have in schools, and in particular feedback that teachers give to pupils. And he said, if feedback falls in a classroom and no one hears it, did it make a sound? And that's really, really a pertinent sort of thought and reflection. Even if you give feedback regularly, is it being heard, and did it make the sound that you want it to make? Because actually, on a daily basis, students and teachers alike are getting a thunderstorm of feedback, and not all of it is being received as intended, or there isn't the time, the breathing space to be able to reflect on it. And so that is something to think about when giving feedback to any student in any context. So what can we do as teachers to create these foundations in which feedback is received as we want it to be received as best as possible? And then action, what strategies can we put in place to enable students to action it? And so first of all, I talk about this idea of priming pupils for feedback. And when I say priming pupils for feedback, it's about creating that curriculum coherence, establishing and embedding the art of success of what it means to be successful in your subject, the clarity of the learning intentions, and creating a receptive culture where they want to receive your feedback. And so how can we do this? Well, first of all, have a couple of minutes, so pause the webinar and have a think about what it is that you do at the moment that primes pupils for feedback out of those 4 different strands. So in terms of sharing the learning intentions and having that curriculum coherence and establishing and embedding the art of success, first of all, we want to show students what the big picture is. Dylan William talks about in his formative assessment strategies, that idea of sharing the learning intentions so that students know where they're going. And so you can see an example of a roadmap, which is a snapshot of a series of 5 or 6 weeks of teaching of one particular unit of study. And here the teacher would narrate the curriculum, they would narrate what's happening every lesson and where they're up to and what the big picture is, how each of these elements connect and link together and how it threads as a whole unit of study. And this is really important because if we're going to give feedback during a lesson, students need to know what they're getting feedback on and what the actual intention was for what it is that they may have been asked to do. And so knowing the learning intentions, knowing the broader curriculum picture, what it actually means, is a critical cog in supporting those next steps. And you can see a second example here, second example of a PE sort of learning journey. And here you can see that there's clear guidance again on what it is that students are going to learn throughout the course of the 5 or 6 weeks of study. And then alongside that, we want, well, what does success look like? How can we embed the art of being successful in your subject, whether you're teaching geography or history or science or maths? What does it mean to be successful? So if they're doing any sort of application task, you can see an example here, to what extent the severity of an earthquake dependent upon levels of wealth. So this is an example of a geography GCSE application task. So if we're going to give feedback to students on this to enable them to feed forward, well, the first thing that we want to do is say, right, well, what does it mean to be successful? And you can see here we've got some clear guidance of what it means to be successful. So we've got SC1, knowledge of the effects of earthquakes. And then we go down to SC2, SC3, 4 and 5, all clear guidance of what is expected to be successful in answering that question. And so that is all examples of how we can clarify the learning intentions, create curriculum coherence, and establish and embed the art of success. And creating that receptive culture is actually preempting and front-loading our comments and our processes in lesson where we are about to give feedback. So for example, if you're doing a daily review, like in Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, he talks about doing a daily review at the start of the lesson. So you might say to pupils, actually, I want you to have a go answering these questions from memory. We're going to do some feedback and share what we've got and share our thoughts and our answers to the questions in the next 5 minutes. So they've prepared, they know what's going to happen. And he said, well, don't worry, we're not going to be collecting marks, we're not marking this, but what we're going to do is see what we can remember. So you haven't got to worry if you get it wrong, because that's all part of learning. And it's building those foundations and front loading those statements so that pupils know what's coming next and they can be prepared for it. Often what happens is when people get feedback, they can be derailed by that feedback because it's not what they were expecting. It's not how they were expecting to get feedback. And so by priming students, by telling them what's coming, how they're going to get feedback at different stages throughout the lesson or over a series lesson is really important for building those foundations for a receptive culture. And so there's some key principles that we can apply to when we give feedback to our students. And those principles of feedback are timely feedback, creating that receptive culture that we just talked about, making our feedback granular, promoting self-regulation to support metacognition, and then a fluid process that flows between different sort of groups, whether it be between teacher and pupil or pupil to pupil. So when we think about timely feedback, it will depend upon the complexity of what we ask the students to do. And this creates a difference between the immediate and delayed type of feedback. Now, in some research, there is evidence to suggest that actually delaying, reducing, and summarizing feedback can be better for long-term learning. So if the task that they're doing is a higher cognitive skill and it's requiring more sort of like depth and thought to it, then actually delaying that feedback slightly can be more beneficial. If it's something that's of a lower cognitive skill and it's recalling key facts, it might be that actually we want to give feedback sooner so that there isn't a misconception or there isn't something that's embedded that we don't want to be embedded. Now, there is research out there that talks about actually, if that happens, what we might want to do is allow the initial error to be forgotten and we recode it, something called the proactive interference. And that might be a situation where there's an ingrained misconception that the student might have, and you want them to try and forget it before you recode it. And then we talk about that receptive culture, and we talked about the idea of building that receptive culture. And this all comes back to something called the attribution theory, whereby typically students would rather be seen as lazy than stupid because they think that effort is flexible, and they think that intelligence is actually fixed, whereas that's not the case. And so creating that culture where students want to receive the feedback, where errors is all part of learning. To improve, we need to keep practicing and get back on. That's really important to build that culture. And then when we actually give feedback, whether it's verbally, whether it's written, we want to give it in a granular way to reduce the cognitive load that's associated with it. We want to alleviate that overwhelming factor so there's not too much, because if students get too much feedback, then it can seem unachievable. And so actually, they don't want to, when they receive it, they don't want to receive it, they don't want to process it, and then they don't action it. So a less is more approach would be more beneficial to support those next steps. And so what can we do in terms of actually doing that in the classroom? So when we do an assessment, it might be that we do like a multiple choice quiz to check for understanding. We want to see what knowledge they can remember. And so you can see an example here of a learning progression assessment where you've got current knowledge that's being taught, prior knowledge that was some gaps and links in with the current knowledge, and then vocab. And what you can do to give feedback quite quickly is you could use a online learning platform like Quizzes, where you pre-generate the multiple choice questions. They can be really powerful to give feedback and check for misconceptions. They can automatically generate the answers straight away. So you've got that rich knowledge of what students know and don't know, and students also know as well, as you can link it to Google Classroom and it will build a picture and a player report for them. And then as teachers, you can use that to look at the bigger picture across teaching groups. Is there a common misconception? Is there a common error where students have struggled for what's having been taught over those few weeks? And so if there is, you can then reteach it, and you can reteach it through looking at it at a different lens, a different angle from what you took the first time round. And so the feedback there to pupils is showing, right, here was some of the misconceptions, here were some of the things we struggled with, and this is what we're going to do to try and close some of those gaps. And then we can have an application part to our assessments where we want them to demonstrate a skill. So for example, it might be one to demonstrate how to explain their ideas, how to assess, how to evaluate, how to compare, how to use graphs. And when we do that, we can then give them feedback through a whole class feedback sheet, like the example on the screen now. And the whole class feedback sheet can be linked directly to that success criteria we talked about earlier. And the next steps can be linked directly to the success criteria. This means that it's quite clear of what we want students to do next in order to move that learning forward. And there'll be a number of strategies that we can undertake in order to help them move forward with their learning. So it might be with the next steps that they might do a task whereby they correct or alter what they'd originally written. They once they've done that, they would then look to feed their learning forward by doing another activity that linked to that particular skill that you wanted them to do. So for example, in this one, explain the social and economic challenges faced in a named UK city. The next task will be something where they're explaining again, but in a different context. So you've given them that breathing space to look at where they had gaps in their application, given them a chance to look at fixing those gaps and time to do that, and then feeding that forward to allow them to have a go at applying it in a different context. That might be the next lesson, or it might be weeks later. It depends on where it would fit with your own scheme of learning. And then to support self-regulation, we want to make sure that what we do creates that automaticity, and students have some clarity of what they're learning and why they're learning it and how to improve themselves. And so Costens, Van Gogh and Pass in 2012 talked about the importance of self-regulated learning. They talked about it being an active and constructive process in which a learner plans, monitors and exerts control over his or her own learning. So what can we do as teachers to support that? Well, initially what we can do is we can get students to look at models. So in those next steps, after they've done their initial answer through that whole class feedback sheet, before they do their next steps, it could be they look at a model and answer and annotate where that answer actually fitted the success criteria. It could be from another student in the class. You can see the example here where they've got a snippet of a paragraph, and then the students are being asked to think, well, where does this particular answer fit with that original success criteria? Get them to really unpick where that's evident in that answer before they then go on to look at their own answers. And this also links into this idea of guided peer feedback. It might not, you might as a teacher show another answer of a student that you've used, but you might also get them to have some conversations about what it is that they've done and the differences between them. And this is something Sadler talked about from his research in 1989, that when pupils have the opportunity to read their peers' work, this allows them to see the examples and identify graduations and the quality, and therefore generate a greater awareness of the strengths and flaws in their own work. And so what we might do is, at the end of having looked and given whole class feedback, before they do anything, we might get them to do some peer conferencing, where they get to reflect on their own response, what feedback they've been given, and they look at each other's work and they have that informal discussion about how their work is different and why it's different, and look at those graduations before they do that next step. And you can support them in that process by providing them with some feedback stems of what it is that you're looking for. Again, this is an opportunity to discuss. They're not marking each other's work. It's just an opportunity to have a conversation and look at those graduations that Sadler talked about. And so by doing that, this allows students to really focus on what to do next. And that's a really important part of giving feedback, because as we said, giving it is the first hurdle. The second hurdle is to ensure that they receive it. and receive it in the way that you had originally intended. And then after that, it's about them actioning it. It's finding ways to action it so that they're able to feed forward into the next steps. Thank you for listening to the webinar, and I hope it was helpful, and I hope it provides some initial glimpses and guidance into how we can give effective and more purposeful feedback in the classroom. There are lots more ideas and strategies in the book that I wrote, The Feedback Pendulum, which you can get from John Katz, or you can get from Amazon as well. Thank you, and see you again soon.